In the humid summers of Colonial Virginia, a small wooden structure stood hidden at the edge of a tobacco field. To most passersby, it looked like any other humble meeting house. But inside, something radical was happening. Enslaved Africans, free black men and women, and even a handful of sympathetic whites gathered quietly to worship together. This was not just a church, it was a place where a new idea was taking root, that faith could exist outside the control of the established Anglican Church and outside the control of slaveholders. It was the birthplace of what many historians now call the first black church in Virginia, and its story is far more complex than most history books ever reveal. The first secret lies in how it began. The church didn't start with a building or a preacher, but with whispers. Late at night, when overseers had gone to sleep, enslaved people would hum spiritual songs softly as they worked, weaving hidden messages into their verses. These were not just prayers, they were a form of resistance. Over time, these secret gatherings grew bolder. A traveling Baptist preacher named Moses, himself a man of African descent, began to visit plantations under the pretense of offering private prayers for the sick. Instead, he would gather groups of slaves and teach them Bible stories about liberation, Moses leading the Israelites, Daniel defying the king, all preaching in prison. The story struck a chord. For people who lived under constant surveillance and punishment, the idea that God stood with the oppressed gave them hope. The gatherings moved from cabins to secluded groves deep in the woods, where a lookout would be posted to watch for patrollers. They would pray, sing, and preach under the stars, far from the eyes of the master. These secret meetings became known as hush harbors, and they laid the foundation for what would eventually become a permanent congregation. It was dangerous. If caught, participants could be whipped, sold away, or worse. But the risk only made their faith stronger. The first church was not just a house of worship, it was an act of defiance against a system designed to strip them of dignity and spirit. By the early 1770s, as revolutionary sentiment was brewing across the colonies, these believers took the daring step of building a physical meeting house. They pooled what little money they had, some even working extra hours after their grueling field labor to buy nails, boards, and candles. The structure they built was small and plain, but it was theirs. They called it the African Baptist Church, and its first official preacher was a man named Gowan Pamphlet, a man who had been born enslaved, secretly licensed to preach by white Baptists, and who risked everything to lead his people in worship. His sermons were fiery, filled with calls for freedom of the soul and hints at freedom of the body. Week after week, the congregation grew, drawing in not just slaves but free blacks and even poor whites, who were disillusioned with the established church's close ties to the colonial elite. This first secret is powerful because it shows that the church was never just about religion. It was about survival, identity, and planting the seed of resistance in a place where rebellion was dangerous. It became a school, a community center, and a political training ground, teaching people to speak, organize, and think about a life beyond bondage. It was here, long before emancipation, that a vision of a freer future was being born quietly, dangerously, and relentlessly. The second secret is that this church became a hidden network for communication. A kind of underground bulletin board long before newspapers or pamphlets could reach the enslaved population. Every Sunday, as members gathered, news traveled faster than in any tavern or town square. Someone might share word of a new law passed by the Colonial Assembly, a change in a master's household, or a rumor about British troops moving closer as tensions with England escalated. For people who were often kept deliberately ignorant, this was a lifeline. It turned the congregation into a living archive of information, empowering them to prepare for changes that might affect their lives. But this network was not only about sharing news. It also became a quiet recruiter of courage. Through coded language in sermons and spirituals, leaders hinted at escape routes, upcoming meetings, or safe people to trust. Spirituals like Steal Way to Jesus weren't just about salvation, they were literal invitations to secret gatherings. When Gowan Pamphlet preached about crossing the Jordan River, listeners knew he might be speaking about crossing into free territory. This was a church that taught people how to read between the lines. And that skill would later be crucial when the American Revolution and, decades later, the Underground Railroad came into play. The church was also where enslaved men and women could speak freely for the first time in their lives. In the fields, their voices were silenced. In the big house, they were invisible. But inside the meeting house, they testified, prayed aloud, even debated. This was political training disguised as worship. They learned how to stand before a group, persuade others, and lead with authority. For some, these skills became tools of escape, rebellion, or later leadership within the free black community. Even white observers noted with unease that these gatherings produced bold, eloquent speakers, something the system of slavery was never meant to allow. The authorities knew something was happening. County courts passed ordinances requiring a white person to be present at black religious gatherings, and patrollers sometimes raided services, but the congregation adapted. They met earlier, moved locations, or split into smaller groups to avoid detection. Each time the rules tightened, the network became more creative and more resilient. This cat-and-mouse game turned the church into one of the first organized forms of black resistance in Virginia, not with weapons, but with discipline, secrecy, and faith. Perhaps most surprising is how this secret network extended beyond religion. Members began to look out for one another, forming what was essentially an early mutual aid society. If someone was sick, the group would share food or care for their children. If someone was beaten, they would send comfort and prayer. This solidarity planted the roots of a community identity that slavery had tried to erase. It was no longer just individuals enduring hardship, they were part of something bigger. Something strong enough to survive even when individuals could not. This second secret shows that the first black church was not just a place to kneel and pray but a place to plan, share, and act. It gave the people inside its walls a sense of power they had been told they could never have, and it terrified those who benefited from keeping them powerless. The third secret is how this church became a bridge between two worlds, the spiritual and the political, at a time when both were on fire. As the American Revolution unfolded, the congregation found itself caught between loyalty to the crown and the promise of liberty preached by patriot leaders. On the one hand, Britain offered enslaved men freedom if they joined the Loyalist cause, and many considered it. On the other hand, the language of the revolution, freedom, rights, equality, stirred something that had been growing inside these worshippers for years. Gowan pamphlets' sermons began to blend biblical imagery with revolutionary ideas, framing the struggle for independence as a parallel to the Israelites escaping Egypt. To enslaved listeners, this was not abstract politics. It was an invitation to imagine that freedom might one day be theirs too. Members of the church quietly watched as militias drilled, as protests turned to war, and as white colonists spoke of liberty while still owning human beings. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed. The meeting house became a forum where people debated whether the revolution would truly mean freedom for all or just a reshuffling of masters. Some decided to take their fate into their own hands, escaping to British lines, joining the fight, or using the chaos of war as cover to disappear. Others stayed and continued to worship, waiting for the day when the ideals of the revolution might finally apply to them. The church's presence during this period also challenged the established Anglican Church, which was deeply tied to colonial authority. The fact that an African-led congregation could grow, thrive, and even ordain its own minister during wartime was seen as dangerous. Yet, paradoxically, the very upheaval of the era gave it space to exist. With colonial officials distracted by war, they had less time to enforce strict control over black gatherings. This breathing room allowed the African Baptist Church to solidify its membership and traditions. Another powerful part of this secret is how the church created its own theology of liberation. While white preachers often used scripture to justify slavery, this congregation reinterpreted those same passages as promises of deliverance. When they sang about being free at last, they weren't only thinking about heaven, they were imagining freedom on Virginia soil. This theological shift was revolutionary. It reframed suffering as temporary, oppression as doomed, and freedom as inevitable. It gave people a sense of destiny, that history itself was on their side. In this way, the church became one of the first places in Virginia where black people collectively envisioned a future balanced. Avery. They were not just surviving anymore, they were preparing. Some began to save money, purchase freedom for family members, or petition for manumission. Others became literate, teaching themselves to read the Bible and, by extension, legal documents, contracts, and petitions. Each of these small acts chipped away at the structure of slavery from within, long before abolition became a national debate. This third secret is a reminder that the first black church was never neutral. It was a participant in the great questions of its time, and its members were thinkers, strategists, and believers all at once. Their faith did not make them passive, it made them bold enough to imagine freedom in a world built to keep them chained. The fourth secret is how the church became the seedbed for leadership, not just spiritual leadership, but civic and social leadership that would shape black communities for generations. Gowan Pamphlet himself is a perfect example. Once an enslaved man working as a tavern host in Williamsburg, he rose to become the first black man formally ordained as a Baptist minister in America. That moment was historic. It meant that a man of African descent, born into bondage, now had the authority to lead a congregation, perform baptisms, and preach freely, the direct challenge to the racial hierarchy of colonial society. His courage inspired others, showing that a black man could hold moral and spiritual authority in a world that denied him legal rights. From this congregation came future teachers, petitioners, and even business owners. The church taught practical skills as much as it taught scripture. People learned to read and write, keep records, and organize events. They learned discipline, to show up on time, to respect order, to handle money collected for the church's upkeep. All of these skills translated into power beyond the church walls. After emancipation decades later, it was these trained, experienced church leaders who would go on to found schools, establish mutual aid societies, and represent their communities in town meetings. The church also gave women a platform in a way that was rare at the time. While formal preaching roles were often held by men, women organized prayer groups, taught children Bible lessons, and quietly acted as keepers of oral history. They passed down stories of how the church was built, who risked punishment to attend, and which hymns carried hidden meanings. Their work kept the identity of the congregation alive through the years when persecution was harshest. This continuity meant that the church wasn't just a gathering place, it became an anchor for black identity in Virginia. Even after Gowan Pamphlet's death, the church endured. And this was no accident. Leaders had prepared for succession, ensuring that the congregation would not crumble if one person was lost. This was radical foresight for a time when enslaved communities could be broken apart at any moment by sale, death, or relocation. They created a structure that was bigger than any single leader, a resilient network that could survive the loss of its founders. That resilience would later prove crucial when black churches became hubs for abolitionist activity, Reconstruction organizing, and civil rights efforts a century later. The fourth secret also involves how the church subtly pushed the boundaries of what was allowed under colonial law. For example, enslaved members who were baptized sometimes used their new Christian identity to argue for better treatment or to request manumission, since Christian doctrine forbade the enslavement of fellow believers in some interpretations. These arguments rarely freed everyone, but they planted legal and moral challenges to the institution of slavery that would grow over time. In many ways, the first black church was a quiet school of freedom, turning ordinary men and women into leaders who would carry forward the struggle long after the revolution ended. It was training not just pastors, but pioneers of black education, entrepreneurship, and activism. The fact that all of this happened under the watchful eye of a slave-holding society is remarkable. It shows that even within oppression, black Virginians were building a future of self-determination, brick by brick, sermon by sermon. The fifth secret is how the first black church in colonial Virginia became a symbol not just to its members, but to everyone who saw it survive despite relentless pressure to disappear. Its very existence was a quiet revolution. Slaveholders feared it because it represented something they could not control, a gathering of black people who shared information, nurtured hope, and built a vision for the future. Every time the congregation gathered, it was proof that the spirit could not be enslaved. That idea alone was dangerous enough to the system that authorities tried repeatedly to shut it down, sometimes by enforcing laws requiring white supervision, sometimes by intimidating preachers, and sometimes by simply burning down meeting houses. But each time, the congregation rebuilt, moving to a new location or starting over from scratch. This cycle of destruction and rebirth turned the church into a living symbol of resilience. One of the most remarkable legacies of this church is how it inspired others. News of its persistence spread to nearby plantations and towns, encouraging other enslaved groups to form their own secret prayer circles and eventually congregations. Within a few decades, there were Black Baptist churches and societies springing up all over Virginia, and later across the South. These were not just religious spaces, they were the first independent Black institutions in America, giving African Americans a sense of ownership, identity, and dignity at a time when nearly every aspect of their lives was controlled by someone else. This symbolic power extended far beyond worship. During the early 1800s, the church became a rallying point for Black petitioners who began submitting formal requests for freedom to colonial and later state authorities. Some of these petitions used religious language, arguing that no true Christian society could justify slavery. Others came from free Black members demanding the right to purchase land, build schools, and live without harassment. These efforts were small, often rejected, but they kept pressure on the legal system, creating a paper trail that would later be cited by abolitionists as proof of a long-standing desire for freedom among the enslaved. Even after the American Revolution ended and Virginia began passing laws restricting Black gatherings more severely, the church never entirely disappeared. It went underground when necessary, holding services in secret, baptizing new believers in remote rivers under the cover of night. The image of men and women wading into dark water to declare their faith while risking arrest is one of the most powerful symbols of the era. It told the world that faith was worth suffering for, and that the dream of freedom could not be legislated out of existence. Today, when historians look back at the origins of Black Christianity in America, they see this first church not as a footnote but as a spark that lit a much larger fire. Its members may never have seen the full fruits of their labor of emancipation, Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, but they laid the groundwork for all of it. Their courage made it possible for later generations to stand up, organize, and demand justice on a national scale. The fifth secret, then, is that this church was never just about the past. It was a prophecy of the future, a reminder that freedom often begins in the smallest, most hidden places, a clearing in the woods, a whispered prayer, a song sung softly so the overseer won't hear. And yet those small beginnings can grow into movements that change nations. The first Black church in Virginia is proof that even in the darkest conditions, hope can be planted, and once planted, it can never truly be uprooted.